This masterclass looks at the persuasive spoken response, or in Queensland, the IA2. So the description from the syllabus is, this assessment focuses on the creation of a perspective through reasoned argument to persuade an audience. It is an open-ended task responding to representations of a contemporary social issue in the media within the previous year. While students may undertake some research in the production of the extended response, it is not the focus of this technique. There is no prescribed text list for this assessment instrument. Students may support their responses with multimodal elements such as digital, appropriate to the context and audience. Now, before you can begin the task, you need to actually understand what it requires. So you're asked to look at a social issue. Well, what exactly is a social issue? A social issue is a common problem in society that has an impact on a large number of people. It's often the consequence of factors that extend beyond an individual's control. And it's often divisive and causes much discussion or debate. The conflicting opinions occur on the grounds of what is perceived as morally correct or incorrect. So remember, it's important also to distinguish between a topic and an issue. So for example, refugees is just a topic. Whether or not refugees should be housed on Manus Island is an issue. It's also really important, as the syllabus stated, to remember that this is not a research assignment. While you may need to do some research to give yourself some content and some facts, you must make sure that you do not just present a factual report on the topic. The purpose of this response is to persuade people to agree with your stance and to take a particular action in response. So what makes a good and memorable public speech? Well, think about some that have become part of our culture. For example, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, or Anna Bly's flood speech, and Julia Gillard's misogyny speech. Consider what it is that makes these speeches good, and what techniques are the speakers using. So let's have a look specifically at the task then. We're going to break down the 3 criteria and explain the objectives in each one and how to meet them. And we're going to use all the top descriptors in each case because we're aiming for the top marks. So, criteria 1 is the knowledge application, and it requires discerning creation of perspectives and representations of concepts, identities, times, and places in a persuasive text. The discerning use of the ways cultural assumptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs underpin texts and invite audiences to take up positions. And the discerning use of aesthetic features and stylistic devices to achieve persuasive purposes. So what does all that mean? Well, let's have a look at them one by one. So the first descriptor is discerning creation of perspectives and representations of concepts, identities, times, and places in a persuasive text. All right, so before you can convince people to change something, you need to understand the status quo. You need to understand what it's currently like. So what attitudes currently exist towards your topic? How are the stakeholders represented? And how can you change this perception? It's not enough just to describe or explain something. Remember, this speech is designed to effect change or to put change into motion. Now, if you've been asked to speak on behalf of a minority group, then you need to consider how this group is usually represented or perceived. And what can you do to help change that perception? So you're going to have to change that perception before you'll be able to persuade people to do things. If they think that you're part of a wacko group, then they're not going to be persuaded by what it is that you have to say. So for example, if you're trying to convince people to stop carrying guns, then you'd need to understand the current attitudes towards guns. Now remember, your intended audience, which is the one that you want to persuade, does not hold the same opinion as you. So how can you persuade them without offending them? Well, if you start by saying only brain-dead rednecks think it's okay to carry guns, your speech isn't going to go very well and you'll probably be shot. So remember, you're not talking to the people in the room who agree with you. They're already on your side. So think about how you can appeal to the people who are against you. So, for example, if you're talking about gun control, rather than arguing that all guns are dangerous, you could say that you feel really sorry for law-abiding gun owners who do the right thing and register their weapons and use them responsibly, because the small minority who are doing the wrong thing are making it really hard for them and taking away their personal rights. When Emma Watson spoke about feminism to the United Nations, she was aware of the fact that the women in the room would be more likely to support her opinion rather than the men. As she points out, the word feminism often carries a negative connotation of strong, opinionated, men-hating women. So rather than talking about the need to improve women's lives, she takes the angle that life is now more complicated for men as a result of inequality and change. In doing so, she manages to get the men to support her argument because she doesn't attack or criticize them in any way. It would have been really easy to have made numerous negative remarks about how badly men have treated women, but she refrained from doing so, knowing that it would ostracize half of her audience. The campaign is even called He for She, so that shows that it's taken from the men's perspective. Emma already had the women in the room on her side, pretty much no matter what she said. So by appealing to the men, she gets 100% of the audience on her side. So think about how your topic is currently perceived. How can you change this perception without antagonizing people? What do you want people to do in response to your speech? This becomes your call to action. So, for example, if we took the topic refugees, before you can convince people to accept refugees, you need to overcome these fears and beliefs. You could start by differentiating between refugees, illegal migrants, and migrants. Set the scene for how these people had no choice but to flee for their lives. Paint a picture of the hardship that they've already experienced. This way, people are going to feel selfish denying them help in order to preserve their own comfortable way of life. Now remember, you can't change something unless you understand and acknowledge what it's currently like. Then, you need to explain how it could be better. All right, the next descriptor then is the discerning use of the ways cultural assumptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs underpin texts and invite audiences to take up positions. So you need to take the attitudes, values, and beliefs that you see in society and use them to your advantage. So for example, if guns are seen as being acceptable, then you need to paint a scenario in which they are anything but. So consider, what do gun owners believe about themselves? Well, they believe that they have a right to carry guns, that they're responsible, and that they're protecting their own safety. So an argument that challenges, not questions, their rights and their safety might appeal. So you would come at it from the angle of there are people doing the wrong thing, and that's really unfair because you people are going to lose your right to carry a gun and to protect yourselves, and that's just really wrong. So what we need is some gun laws to make sure that the people who have always done and are still doing the right thing are fine, but that it takes into consideration the people doing the wrong thing and it gets them and their guns off the streets. So the issue then, of course, becomes not so much about the guns, but about these people protecting their own rights, which they're far more likely to be on side with. Now we need to remember that all subjects and all words carry connotations. There's certain issues or words that we use in relation to these topics that will immediately polarize people, regardless of what facts might be presented. So for example, words such as refugee, bachelor and spinster, teenager, environmentalist, and anti-vaxxer all have connotations. And when you say these words, people immediately form an opinion and a judgment of what those people are like. So often you're going to have to overcome those connotations, or you might be able to really use those connotations and use them to your advantage. So the trick is, as I said, is to use them to your advantage. You can use slogans, metaphors, and anecdotes that relate to these beliefs. Now make sure that you represent the beliefs, attitudes, and values of the society that you're addressing, so that your audience comes from. So don't, for example, say it is our constitutional right to bear arms or that it's part of the Declaration of Independence, because in Australia it's not. So if you're speaking to an Australian audience, be careful not to use American attitudes, values, and beliefs. All right, and then the third descriptor is the discerning use of aesthetic features and stylistic devices to achieve persuasive purposes. So let's see what that means. All right, there's a number of persuasive techniques that we would expect to see in your speech. So these are 9 of them. Now, you probably aren't going to be able to use all 9, but we do need to see these techniques. So we need to see ethos, pathos, and logos. We need to see inclusive language, high modality, repetition, the rule of 3, rhetorical questions, metaphors and extended metaphors, a catchphrase, and a call to action. So let's have a look at what they all are. So ethos, pathos, logos. So ethos is the credibility of the argument. So people are much more likely to listen to an expert. So you're going to have to establish some credentials. You need to explain why you're speaking. Now, as a teenager, this gets a bit tricky, but you can at least say that you represent the society of the future. And if you quote recognized experts, that's going to help to build your credibility. Pathos, this is the emotional level of the content. So we respond much better to things that have an emotional effect on us. So how can you make people care? How can you tug at their heartstrings? And how can you encourage them to get up and make a difference to actually help others? And then logos refers to our sense of logic. So here people are looking for proof. Now, although a persuasive speech draws heavily on emotion, you do need to be able to back up your argument with evidence. So facts, figures, statistics all show proven research and knowledge. All right, then you need to use inclusive language. So you want to use we to avoid creating an us and them situation. So think about how people react to Greta Thunberg's speech to the United Nations. I think I've spelt it wrong there. Now, again, you can view this speech in this module. People will react more favourably to you if they believe that you're in the same boat as them. You'll have to make the same sacrifices that you're asking them to make. So when you watch Greta's speech, you'll see that it's got a lot of really good elements in it, in that she's very passionate and she's very clear and she uses a lot of facts and figures and statistics, but she uses a very accusatory tone and it becomes very divisive. And so you either really side with her or you really turn against her. Now, high modality language indicates a sense of urgency and a lack of options. So instead of saying we should do something, we say we must do something, or it's imperative that we do something. So you give people no option. Now, this same level of modality needs to apply to individual word choices. So consider the difference between saying people died or people were killed or people were slaughtered. Okay, or these people are scared, these people are afraid, or these people are terrified. So those words all have different modality, and we can see they go from weaker to stronger. Repetition. When we repeat keywords or phrases, we give people an extra opportunity to take them in, and we also emphasize their importance. So we might say something like, 10 million people are forced to flee their homes each year. 10 million people. That's 1/3 of the population of Australia. Now, I don't know if that fact or statistic is right at all. I just made it up. But I'm showing you how repetition works. Okay, there's a thing called the rule of 3. Now, saying the same thing 3 ways is another good way to reinforce it. So think of Julius Caesar's words, I came, I saw, I conquered. You might say that something is a social, political, and economic imperative. And you don't have to read too many persuasive speeches before you constantly see that rule of 3 coming into play. Rhetorical questions, these are the ones to which you don't really expect an answer, but they're designed to make people think or to put them in other people's shoes. So for example, you might ask, how would you feel if our government treated your children this way? Metaphor and extended metaphor, well, apart from making our content more interesting, the use of metaphors does a lot of the work for us by linking to known images and ideas. You might be talking about youth crime, for example, and how a lot of it's caused by boredom. So you could use the metaphor of a lion in a cage with nothing to do and how they're going to get more and more aggressive. Now, an extended metaphor is one that runs throughout your speech. So if we go back to our refugee topic, you might refer to our multicultural society as a tapestry and the individual cultures as the threads. Now, removing a thread would make the pattern less interesting and potentially unravel the entire fabric of society. So you can see how that metaphor would run the whole way through your speech. A catchphrase. Using one phrase throughout your speech helps serve as a connective as well as giving emphasis to the key idea. So if you think about Martin Luther King Jr.'s phrase, "I have a dream," he uses it numerous times throughout his speech and it becomes like an earworm. It's something that sticks around for ages. And then a call to action. Your speech needs to finish with a call to action. What exactly do you want people to do after they hear your argument? Now, be careful here. Ultimately, you probably want them to fix global warming or do something huge, but that's not a logical request. And if you present that, people are just going to say, well, I'm only one individual person. I can't possibly fix that whole situation. So you need to think of something that everyone could do immediately. So for example, they could sign a petition or they might stop using GladWrap. Something that is actually achievable after all of this. Okay, and some general techniques. Try and humanize the issue. If you talk generally about an issue, it has far less impact than if your audience can picture the people involved. So use examples, anecdotes, names of individuals, case studies, etc. Remain sympathetic to any innocent people who have been affected. Refer to the fact that important people have made these decisions, so that gives authority and credibility and shows that the matter's been given careful consideration and it's not just a knee-jerk reaction. And avoid placing blame on any particular group. Reference some specific events that'll help support your cause. Name the key stakeholders. Play on the implied guilt of individuals because we're all partially to blame. Play on collectivism, so this idea that together we can make a difference. And play to our feelings of patriotism. We are Australians, it's our duty to do this. So remember, the purpose of this speech is to persuade people to agree with your stance and to take action to create change. It is not just an information report. You will need to do some research, but it's these techniques that are important, just as important and arguably more so than the content. Your job is to stir up people's emotions and make them care enough to want change for the better.